Thank you very much for tuning in today. It's also a pleasure to be asked to take part in this lecture series. And I guess, when you're a photographer, uh, people often ask you, what are your influences and or who you're influenced by? And I guess it's quite fitting that we're talking about this work is done on Windrush Day, and I'm talking about my parents. My parents, both my mum and dad, were major influences in my photography. Remember, my mum took out a loan to buy me a new camera, and she had to take on extra hours at this factory which she hated. And my kind of father was always posing for portraits for me. My mom was quite shy and didn't like to be photographed, but dad would always uh, take up the difficult position of posing for my camera. But also, I guess, influences in terms of an indirect sense, because I remember as a very small child, about 5 or 6, waking up one morning and I guess hearing my mom crying outside of my bedroom door, and I kind of ventured to the top of the landing and looked down and saw her at the bottom steps crying. And when you're a child and you see a parent who you presume to be a superhero crying, it's quite a kind of alarming thing. And after a while, she got up and left, and she'd left an email letter on the bottom step. And I crept downstairs and I kind of opened up the envelope, and inside was a kind of square Polaroid picture. And it was just a picture of a grave and a tombstone from Jamaica. And what had happened is that her brother had died in Jamaica, and her stepmother, who she didn't really get on with, didn't tell her till after he had died and after he was buried. But it was this idea that this small piece of paper could have this powerful impact on somebody that perhaps wasn't the catalyst for my photography, but was something that um, stuck with me, something which I kind of thought about. And I can't say for definite, but I think that was a kind of a major impact in my photography. And in more contemporary terms, my photography has been focused on looking at my family, but also my own experiences of blackness in Britain. And I guess I'm kind of interested in those notions of home, belonging, but also those questions of transnational migration. And there are many universalities of migration. Whether it's you come as an economic migrant, or whether you are coming to the motherland, or whether you are a refugee, when you move from one place to another, eh, when you have an identity in one place and you have to come to another place to reconstruct a new identity, and a party was trying to hang on to the identity which you had in your home country, the migrant often ends up being in a inauthentic mid position, stuck between those two spaces. And I guess I've kind of explored some of those issues around that over the years. But I guess, what I'm interested in, where my interest in photography also stems from, is that question of, who gets to tell the story, and who often in documentary practice, my background was in documentary photography. There's always an uneven imbalance between those who look and those who are being looked at. And I guess we all know that photography has a problematic history. And let's not mince our words. It's been used as an instrument of anti-black violence and racism over the years. We can see photography being used as a tool, as an instrument of the colonial project. And I guess regretfully, the legacies of those tropes and stereotypes still exist in contemporary photography. And I guess my work also is kind of based in a long history of black photographers who are attempting or being forced to having to humanize their representations. And because they're not usually used to seeing their lived experience reflected or represented back to them in the ways in which they exist. in the media. And I guess historically we have individuals such as Frederick Douglass, who in the 19th century became the most photographed American, who used photography as a way of, as I said, kind of humanizing himself, but also trying to create a counter narrative to the dominant fictions of America at the time. Probably still at the same time, where in which notions of blackness were seen in problematic ways. And Frederick Douglass, he kind of he kind of used photography as a way of giving himself agency, and he used photography. He saw photography at that particular time in the 19th century as something which could be seen as a democratic tool and instrument, which could create opportunities for all groups of people to represent themselves as ways in which they saw themselves to exist. And over his life, he photographed himself, and over in different periods of his life, up until being an elderly man. And indeed, the very last photograph of him is taken after his death. But we also have practitioners, academics, Professor W.B. Du Bois, as he's described, as his name is described in America, or W.B. Du Bois. And so he was also an advocate of the ways in which photography could be used to, I guess, as a counter narrative to the myths of blackness, which were being constructed by people who weren't black in that sense. And in 1900, and the International Exposition in Paris, he put on the American Negro exhibit, which was a collection of photographs and images, but also infographics, which charted and demonstrated the progress of African Americans in the 35 years since the abolition of slavery. And this idea of taking images of which again were counter narratives, and he in Atlanta, Georgia, he kind of photographed a kind of cross section of the black middle classes. And so here we have, the International Exposition of 1900, which won the gold medal and was lauded in Paris, in Europe. And yeah, if we look at the images which still were being constructed, this is 9 years afterwards, we still have these anthropological images being made. And as I kind of mentioned before about contemporary photography, we still have to question how Black people are represented in photojournalism and documentary. The idea of Black bodies in crisis seem to be an ever-present factor within this type of photography. And if you imagine since the first true representation of a photograph in a newspaper in 1901 in the Daily Sketch, imagine in that time how many photographs of Black people have been present, but how many of those images have actually been taken by Black people. And so over that period of time, we have representations and notions of representations constructed, which perhaps aren't exactly truthful representations of the people being represented. So, as I said, my work is in a I guess, in a long lineage of photographers who are attempting to humanize their own experience. And as I was quite fortunate to have this written by Professor Eddie Chambers, British life has had the disastrous effect of immigrants not being routinely regarded as sensitive human beings, but being instead cast as vexatious problems. Work restores humanity to people from whom the critical characteristic has been routinely withheld or withdrawn. And in restoring humanity, 1,000 stories of life can be and are told. And so, you know, you can argue that I'm an activist in terms of what I do. I wouldn't say that I'm a propagandist, because I'm attempting to look at life in all of its spectrums. And sometimes, you know, that isn't always entirely a happy reflection of life, but it's a truthful reflection in terms of how I experience it, I guess. And so I'm going to talk mainly about the work from a small island, which, as Emily was mentioned, was exhibited 3 years ago now. And since that time, the work has progressed to, I guess, encompass 2 additional chapters. Whereas the first chapter, From a Small Island, sought to, you know, look at my kind of parents, predominantly my mother's journey from Jamaica to the UK. And, you know, I guess I should say that both my parents left Jamaica to come to Britain as British citizens. You know, they were invited to come to Britain and to, you know, help rebuild this a country broken and damaged after the Second World War. You know, a country where 250,000 soldiers were killed and nearly 100,000 civilians were killed. Infrastructure was damaged and destroyed, and, you know, the invitation was given out to the Commonwealth to come and help rebuild. My parents were part of those groups of people from all across the Commonwealth who came to Britain. And the first work in that series sought to explore not only that journey of my parents, but in one sense, how their experiences had shaped my notions of self. And I'll talk later on about that in a minute. And so now the second and third chapters are, the second chapter, which is where this image comes from, The Last Days of Summer, seeks to explore that journey of the third and fourth generation, who are coming to the end of their youth at a time when Britain has changed their immigration policy. You know, that wave of immigration that brought my parents and others to Britain will never happen again, probably, in Britain. And if it does, it won't happen for a very long period of time. Britain, in a post-Brexit sense, is an attempt to, I guess, forget those histories of the past and trying to reclaim a new identity, perhaps. And as I said, that level of migration into Britain won't be seen again. And it's the work follows a group of young people who originally began to photograph in 2008, which was coincidentally the same time I began to photograph my family. And over that period of time, I've kind of kept in touch with individuals and charted their experience. And, you know, that has been at times, you know, a difficult one, being an observer to other people's lives, where people who were quite young and had that degree of optimism perhaps have seen that optimism dissolve. And I often think that no matter how hard it was for my parents' generation to come to Britain, and the overt racism which they faced, you know, my parents were denied the ability to buy houses in particular areas. They were denied access to the church they wanted to go to. They were denied access to pubs and bars. No matter how difficult it was for my parents' generation, it was almost as if the system, in inverted commas, wasn't ready for them. And in that sense, the system seems to have been harder for their parents, for their children and their grandchildren in that sense, because unfortunately the system is prepared for them. You know, as a graduate, you know, statistically, I'm going to earn less than another graduate with the same qualifications as me. Statistically, I'm going to be stopped and searched by the police 9 to 10 times more than a white man. So even though we're celebrating Windrush today, we have to be aware of the situations which we live in, and we're still living in a situation which there are certain injustices based on race, and we have to be honest about that. But so the second chapter is exploring that the kind of end of youth, perhaps, but also the end of youth is also a metaphor for the end of that migration which brought their grandparents to Britain. And the third and final chapter of that trilogy is a work called From Whence We Came, which in one sense looks at that desire for return, and return also in the concept of a voluntary return, but also an involuntary return. And in the case of Junior, who was deported to Jamaica 6 years ago without any chance of return, but also that this particular work is still in development, and it's still unresolved. But I guess there is also an aspect of sadness within that, because for many people who are attempting to return, they're perhaps kind of returning to a world which doesn't exist anymore, and they're returning to an attempt to find a past which can't be found again. So I guess just before I kind of move on to discuss From a Small Island in more detail, just want to, I guess, explore my development again as a photographer. And as I said, my background was one of a documentary photography, and one in which I was interested in telling stories. And as I said, I was very, very keen to use photography as a medium to as one which was a counter narrative to many of the kind of dominant fictions which I would see myself represented within. I had this kind of perhaps naive idea that I could work in the media and perhaps create those counter narratives that way. But then I found that I was doing work for national publications, and I was very lucky to get those jobs. But then out of 10 jobs which I was given to photograph white identities, and I'll be able to demonstrate those identities in a range of experience, from happy to sad, from wealthy car designers to war widows to accomplished playwrights to whatever. And then when I'm asked to photograph a black person, I was asked to photograph a criminal. And so I'd have to ask myself, here I am wanting to use my position in the media to counter particular narratives, but was I actually counter them, or was I reinforcing them perhaps? And so I kind of looked into the idea of doing personal works, in that sense, works which I thought I could have total control of. And one of the works was a work I did in South Africa. And I guess this work was instrumental in perhaps raising the issue of, again, of who is telling the story. And just because, I'm a black man photographing other black people, am I the right person to be telling this particular story? Am I the one who should be telling South African stories, perhaps? And I guess I also had this another naive idea in my practice that I wanted to be, I guess, a conflict photographer, which unfortunately I quickly found wasn't for me in that sense. But it's particularly this image where I was taken here by a doctor, a friend of mine, who told me that you've come to South Africa to see how people live. You have to see how they die. And I worked in a trauma unit for a week. And this particular image, I guess, caused me to raise all of these kind of lots of questions about my practice, and who was it for, perhaps, and what was the point of it. because when I came back to England and the work was exhibited, people spoke about the aesthetics of the image. They talked about some people one person wanted to buy the image, but nobody asked me who this person was or what had happened, and I perhaps thought, questioned my own practice, and as I said before, questioned whether I was the right person to be telling this story. Am I the right person to be telling the story of a black man in South Africa, or black people in South Africa, and experiences which I have no lived experience of? Because essentially I'm coming back to England and talking about these stories through the filter of my own experience. If I then go back to South Africa, what am I doing? I'm telling these South Africans about their own experience, which seems crazy in that sense. So, I came back to England and I began to think about my own, where are my own stories? What is my own experience? And I also kind of thought about the idea of telling stories, and and I was kind of fortunate to start a company called Some Cities with a colleague, where we began to create opportunities to enable people to tell their own stories through photography. We do workshops and seminars and so forth, and we gave people a platform where their stories could be reflected in that sense. And that's something which I'm interested in, well, still doing now in Montreal, where I'm also based. And so it was after the exhibition in 2007, I began to, I guess, photograph an experience which was my own in that sense. And it kind of coincided at the time when, unfortunately, my father was seriously ill. And I'd kind of begun to, think about the idea of that I'd photographed my father over many years, but mainly when I wanted to experiment with a new film stock or experiment with a new camera or new lens. And I'd realized I hadn't really kind of photographed my parents in a concerted way until this moment in time. And so I guess prompted by a body of work which I'd seen by a photographer called Paddy Sutherland, who had photographed his parents over a number of years, I kind of began to photograph my own family. Perhaps, not as an inverted commas project, just for myself, not with the idea that anybody else would see this work. There's more the chance, I guess, as my parents were both aging, and that those kind of the balances of child and parents were shifting in one sense, and perhaps just as kind of Paddy Sutherland had mentioned, with a desire to stop my parents from aging and stop parents from I guess slipping away, I began to photograph them. And photography is a very cruel and yet beautiful medium, because in the blink of an eye we can see my mother as a teenager with the world in front of her, to an elderly woman who was coming to the end, or towards the end of her journey, unfortunately. And when I started the work in 2008, I knew it was a work which I would continue and carry on, and in many ways I guess I still am. But it was I guess in many ways it was a difficult experience. And just I guess as a photographer I was interested in photo ethics. I talk about the ethics of representation a lot, just as it was in the work I mentioned about South Africa, where perhaps I wasn't, just because I was photographing other Black people, doesn't mean that I was the right person to be telling that particular story. I often, question my position as a son, photographing his own family. And there are those ethics even when photographing members of your own family or people who are close to you. But when I started the work in 2008, I started under the idea that there wouldn't be any legacy for my kind of parents. And I know I'm saying that on Windrush Day, but I didn't believe that there would be any kind of legacy at that time. I didn't believe that there'd be any memorials or busts for that group of people who came over. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to create a representation of my parents, to have a document which said that they were alive, they existed, that they lived in this country. And as the more I continued to make photographs, I began to think about those representations of Black people, Black bodies in photographs, in photography. And I was aware in terms of photography really kind of reflected notions of Blackness in domestic environments, notions of, in inverted commas again, normality, but also works about migration and immigration, were always posited as short-term problems. Though I hadn't really seen many works or any works at all which kind of explored migration in terms of the sense of, well, what happens when migrants come and they stay, they don't go home? What happens when they age, when they become elderly? And all of those factors I was very interested in documenting. But also, what I was interested in documenting too, and which is why I'm very pleased that what particular images were chosen for the BMX collection, were these images of love between my parents. My parents were married for over 50 years. Sadly, my mum died a few years ago. And, the idea that an image of my mom and my dad and an image that represents their relationship is going to be held in a collection of art is, very meaningful for me. And I know it would have been very meaningful for my mother. But, one of the kind of symbolic images for me within the series is this image taken in Montego Bay. And it's an image which kind of represents so much of what is and what was Jamaica. And I guess the national motto of land, of wood and water, the water is reflected there, but also the sea is where enslaved people were brought across to come to Jamaica to work the land, but also the sea is where my mother left to come to England. And for me, this this image is very symbolic of that journey of my mother. And as I kind of mentioned before, my mother never returned to Jamaica again, and she never saw her father or her brother again. And I think where that image is really symbolic also is that I think because there was never any kind of resolution in terms of my mum's dad's death or a brother's death, I always felt that somehow she was always out at sea, that she never really got off the SS Epenia, was the ship which brought her over to Britain. And she used to speak of her journey on the cruise ship which brought her over as the best time of her life. For the first time, she was an adult. She was free from her father. She could wear makeup. She could have a drink on the ship. She was with her friends, and she had the best time of her life. And I think in many ways, she never really got off that ship. All of her stories about, of which she would talk to us about, were always about Jamaica, and which was quite sad in many respects because she lived more than 3/4 of her life in England, and yet all of her stories were about Jamaica. And I guess maybe she spoke about Jamaica so much because it was an attempt to keep her brother and father alive. And it was kind of I guess the idea, all of those stories of Jamaica perhaps also shaped my experience of the space, even though I didn't go there until a relatively short time ago. And as the work initially began as one which explored my kind of parents' new life within within the four walls of their home. I had this initial idea that as they were aging and becoming infirm, that was going to be a metaphor for the industrial base which they'd come to work within in the Black Country in the in the West Midlands. And the idea was I was going to kind of juxtapose these previous and past industrial spaces with my parents. But as the kind of work developed, I began to think about how their stories of home had shaped my perception, shaped my own kind of selfhood. And it was the idea that when I was growing up in Britain and I wasn't entirely sure of my sense of belonging to Britain, not because I didn't want to belong, but because other people would tell me vocally that I didn't belong, I'd often retreat into my parents' stories of home, and and in many respects claim those stories as my own. And it wasn't until 2017, as the work developed and grew, as I began those images of within my parents' home, and where a work which had been just for myself, perhaps some of my family, uh, and I had an opportunity to speak to Craig Ashley, who was curator at Visual Program at Mac at the time, and talking about different works and projects. And I happened to show images which I've been taking my parents, and from conversations from there, I began to think about opportunities of expanding. I thought about, what my parents and that generation had come to England, but what did they leave behind in Jamaica? What was the vacuum which existed? What happened to Jamaica? But also thought about, well, what happened to the people who stayed? What happened to their generation who didn't leave? What were the trajectories of their life? And I was able to, as the work developed and so forth, and with the with an Arts Council grant, I was able to go over to Jamaica and explore those other avenues, which kind of added and developed the work. And I was able to find the street in which my mother once lived. And, it was this idea of, all of those stories. I, I guess my return was attempt to detangle fact from fiction, and, detangle the reality from the myth and the folklore, which becomes our family narratives. And it was sadly, ultimately, as the descendants of enslaved people, histories are very unclear. And I understand now as an adult, when I used to ask my parents questions about the past and about their family, that they would tell me that this is big people's business, not because they were being rude, but because they didn't know themselves. And there was perhaps a degree of anxiety about not knowing their own histories. And I found that going to Jamaica, something which I thought which would be something that was always close to my parents, but this journey back to Jamaica, I thought would draw us closer together, because we'd have a bond, and I would have an awareness of the space in which they grew up and lived. I found became problematic, because I came back to England and I would tell them that this street doesn't exist anymore, that shop's gone, that building's gone, they've built a road of down there now. And because my parents had never gone back to Jamaica, their Jamaicanness was defined by these memories, which we were caught up in a time capsule. And suddenly I would start to erase these memories from them, and their grip on their Jamaican identity would become tenuous. And so I realized I had to stop telling them these stories because I was erasing their histories. I was erasing those waypoints which held them to a Jamaican identity. But was also curious was that the kind of language which I'd learned from my parents, the patois which I'd learned from them, when I went back to Jamaica, people would look at me and think, well, what's this guy talking about? Because I was using language from 1950s, which my parents were still hanging on to because that was their last experience of being Jamaican. And they'd pass that down to their children, who are now, me now going out to Jamaica in 2017, using words which hadn't been used since 1956. And I guess this kind of space of Jamaica, which I had kind of hung on to and used as an anchor when my own English identity was called into question, I suddenly went over to Jamaica as an adult man, knowing that I'm not Jamaican, but expecting some sense of connection. I was quickly asked, well, where are you going, Englishman? When I went to photograph my mum's old home, somebody walked up to me and asked, have I come to take it back? Where I quickly had to say no, because this was in an area called Jonestown, which was let's just say a difficult area because of lots of past occurrences, which I could go off at a tangent now and talk about politics of Jamaica in the 1970s and the kind of foreign pushing into guns into Jamaica by foreign governments, etc., etc. But that might take us up at a tangent. But also, what I sought to explore as the work developed and grew was to look at the kind of different possibilities of migration. My mother had an opportunity to go and live with an uncle in Brooklyn, and I always kind of wondered what her life would have been if she'd taken that path in life instead of coming to Britain. She would have gone to live with her cousins Gertrude and Charles and their older brother, but instead she chose to come to England. And if she'd taken that journey to America, obviously I wouldn't be here now talking to. But I wonder what her life would have become, because Gertrude went on to become a lieutenant colonel in the American Army in charge of nursing. And Charles went on to own his own dentistry practice and is now retired in a gated community in Florida. I'm not saying that her life would have taken that path, but I wonder what it would have been. And migrants make those decisions. They go here, they go there, and those are going to have major impacts in their lives to come, and also on their children. And it was kind of interesting that my first trip to Jamaica in January 2017, I received a message on LinkedIn from somebody who told me that she was the daughter of the cousin who my mother would have gone to live with. And by a strange quirk of fate, Charles was going to be in Montego Bay in February when I was going to be out there going to a dentistry conference. And I had to think of that as this kind of crazy coincidence that his daughter would find me on LinkedIn and talk to me. And he was going to be out in Jamaica, and I was able to meet Charles out in Jamaica when I was out there, and he kind of fill me in on the blanks of my kind of family history, a history which my mom didn't know. And so there was the work began, and he took on from a work which began to look at my parents in their home, and he took me back to Jamaica, but he also took me back to me finding that I didn't find the acceptance in Jamaica that I'd sought. And so the work also kind of encompassed my experience within this space. and that kind of questioning of belonging also. But I was also interested in Jamaica in terms of the politics of the space. And whilst there's from as somebody who is the descendant of Jamaicans and someone who sees myself as someone who is going to at some point live out in Jamaica, um, I'm curious about Jamaica as a space, and I'm curious how, in ways, Jamaica is a space that is still, you know, living in the wake of colonialism, and its laws, its rules, its kind of notions of shelf, questions of shadism, all stem from the colonial time, but also in the ways in which that kind of colonial uh, um, identities have shifted into neo-colonial ones, where now we see beaches owned by foreign corporations, where cruise ships come in. And it might be difficult to see in this image, but where that red overturned boat is, and where the men in yellow tops are, there's a fence, and the Jamaicans are on one side of the fence, and the tourists are on the others. The tourists are on the golden beaches, and the Jamaicans aren't. And these beaches are owned by foreign corporations who, their cruise liners come in, they drop off the tourists for 5 hours, they get back on the cruise liner, and they country money goes out of the country. So there was what I guess why the work developed into the following two chapters was just there was too much to explore in this particular approach, and there was too much to think about, too much to encompass within one body of work. But there was perhaps too much for me to make sense of also, because going out to Jamaica for the first time as an adult and trying to make work about that experience in a space where I was still trying to come to terms with it was a difficult one, and that was compounded by the fact that I was shooting this on film in a country that didn't have any facilities to develop film. So I was almost working in the dark. And sorry, I should have shown that this was a part of a diptych. So I was working in the dark in one respects. That I came back to England with over several hundred rolls of film, which which I didn't really know what I had. And it was quite of a foolhardy exercise in one respects, because even though everything worked out fine, what if my camera wasn't working? And I wasn't able to find out until I'd come back. But maybe, that just would have been the work, and I guess. So what began as a work exploring my parents' journey, I guess, became into a work exploring my connections to Jamaica. And if I'm, honest, I didn't really understand, because um, mainly because of, I guess, a feeling of rejection. And I'm not really sure why I thought my um, my feelings would be different, because I'm a man who was born in England, spoke with an English accent, lived in Jamaica all of my life at that time, and I'm not really sure what I was expecting to find. And so I guess returning back to my parents in the home, it was one which proved to be a very difficult work, because essentially you're photographing your parents aging. And unfortunately, as the work developed, my mom sadly developed dementia, and that journey was a difficult one for her, obviously, but for all of us, because all of those years and missed opportunities of talking about my mom's experience were going with her. And just as I was finding a belonging or sense of commonality or connection to Jamaica, and developing my own stories about the space. Stories of Jamaica were disappearing, and it was always kind of sad seeing the stories appear in contemporary senses, and stories of a father, of a brother. And I guess, that kind of compounded the idea that my mom never really got off the ship which brought her to Britain. And, that notion of aging and was, I guess, compounded within the work. And I think we're coming up to end of my talk here, but I'm just going to end on the image, one of the images which was collected by the archive, and it's an image of my mum and dad. Sadly, my dad is paralyzed, and he slept in a hospital bed at home. My mum would always kiss him goodnight, and I guess this is a kind of fitting image which to end on.
Thank you, Andrew. It's beautiful. I feel a bit overcome, so I have to compose myself and think of something sensible to say. We all absolutely love this image. It was so hard selecting work from the exhibition to go into the collection for perpetuity, because the story you're telling is one that is so important, that it's told and you encapsulate it so beautifully, and there's such wonderful considerations of the thought about ethics, the complexity of your different relationships. I think they're such important documents for the future of the museum collection. And before if people have questions, could they please add it to the chat? And while they're coming in, based on that, I'd love if you could give us some. So I like to think in the future this film will be on file, and say 50, 100 years from now, what advice would you give to a curator who wants to make sure that your stories are tenderly held and told with the ethics and consideration that they've had up to this point?
I think, archives are, in many respects, archives remind me of photographs, because archives, like photographs, aren't objective. They're subjective. Somebody has to choose what goes in and what doesn't go in. Somebody has to choose what's preserved and what isn't, I guess. And sometimes maybe archives try to reflect the best of a society, or reflect society's impressions of itself. But I think and I'm not just saying it because you purchased my work, but I think societies which should reflect, archives should reflect society, and should reflect the range of societies which are present within the societies, but also reflect them in a sense that they're custodians for the future, and that they're telling stories. Maybe I don't want to get too political, but we're in a time where a British government says that there isn't any institutional and systemic racism. On the day where we have Windrush Day, we have government reports that saying that schools shouldn't be using the term white privilege. And so we have to remember that the histories, the laws, and the ideas, and what we choose to live with now won't always be the ones in which future generations are living in. 50 years time, when the Windrush generation perhaps will go back to not being discussed or spoken about, these stories again will be lost. And so it's important that these stories are being preserved and captured now. And one of the main reason for doing the work about my parents was that there would be a record of their experience, that the fact that they lived here, that they were arrived and they contributed. They were asked to come to Britain, and they came as British citizens. Their passports said they were British. And so I'm sure in 50 years' time, a lot of those stories will be lost. curriculums will exist in ways in which they're not discussed, or histories are, as a quote I had before, history is told by the winners. And I'm probably rambling on now, but I think if we take Britain on a trajectory where it is now politically, history perhaps won't be kind to notions of immigration. And I think it's important that those stories are preserved now. I think that there's a record of it and them who came.
So I would love to know, especially in terms of telling their story properly, I'd love to know more about how your mum and dad felt about suddenly becoming your protagonists.
I think my dad in particular was quite used to, another side, I'm doing a project just about my father at the moment. My father, a work about me and my father. And a part of that work is to using all of those portraits I took of my father over these years. And I'm currently in a position where I'm moving out of Britain. And I guess it's not until I've became an immigrant myself to another country that the weight of my parents' experience has kind of really come home to me. The idea, I was born in England, and I love England. I love, no matter what I talk about, the political context of everything, I'm British, I'm English, and suddenly living in a different country suddenly makes all of that even more apparent. And now I think about my parents leaving Jamaica and coming to a time in Britain which was completely alien to them. Living in a country of chimneys, of smoke rising up into the air. Everything was strange to my parents. They were told that England was a country of gentlemen. And the first thing that my dad saw when he came to England at Victoria train station was a drunk having his shoes robbed by two other guys. And he was thinking, well, is this the country of gentlemen? They went to the cinema and they were expecting to stand up, because at the end, when they watched films in Jamaica, they had to stand up for the national anthem. Nobody stood up for the national anthem. And so this idea of Britain was so alien to them. And I guess it wasn't until I've become a migrant to another country that all of these issues became meaningful, I guess. And sorry, I've totally forgot your question. But I think this, this story of my parents' generation's migration to England isn't over. It's ongoing. It's been told in the second and third generation. It's been told in their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who, are still living with the consequences of their decision to come to Britain.
I've got a question from Sarah Wajid. She said, thank you for your work and talk. Could you tell us more about your transition away from reportage and working for newspapers? Do you still work for media outlets? Are there parallels with media outlets and galleries?
Yeah, I guess in terms of the fact that there's a commission, there's a, you are, working, being commissioned by a gallery to do a work. I guess there's a greater degree of freedom. Working, in an editorial sense, you're more of a tradesperson than a creative person. You have to obviously be creative, but you're given a brief. I thought I was off the job to do a job on Thursday for the Wall Street Journal, which I couldn't do, unfortunately. But essentially, you're given a brief, and you're asked to facilitate, to make an image which fits into a story which might have already been written. You might be asked to take a portrait of somebody, and the layout's already been put together, the interview had already been done, and you can only do an upright picture, for example. So there are certain limitations on working in an editorial sense, and working on your own personal work. You set the discourse of what this work is about. you know, it's your work. You have the control and freedom to think about what images you put in and so forth and whatever. And so in terms of working in an editorial sense, you know, there are constraints on what you do. There are you might even be told by an editor that they want someone to look up a particular way, and so there are, you know, constraints in that sense, which when you want to work in a more artistic way, those can be limiting, perhaps. And so, you know, as I'm getting older, and if I take into consideration that this work started in 2008 and wasn't, you know, exhibited until 2018, sometimes personal works take a long period of time, and maybe you know, works that maybe I need to focus more on my own personal works in that sense, and so maybe I'm more focused in trying to find ways of making works which are important to me rather than doing editorial works. And but if there's any picture editors watching this, I would still love to be hired by you. Thank you very much.
Right, I think on that note, we should probably draw it to a close. Thank you so much. I always love hearing you talk about your work, and it's really nice to be able to share how important these new acquisitions are. Thank you everyone for coming, and I could, if you can, I'm going to put a link to, well, there we go, to somewhere, a short questionnaire for our funders. So if you've got time, could you please click on that and fill it in. So thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you everyone for coming.